On June 30th, 1982, conservative activist Phyllis Schlafly threw a party for more than 1,000 guests in a Washington, D.C. hotel ballroom, festooned with red, white, and blue balloons and streamers. Resplendent in a long string of pearls in a white dress with butterfly sleeves, Schlafly was positively triumphant. The night before, the 10-year timetable for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment had expired, and the measure had failed to pass. As Schlafly and Republican leading lights from President Ronald Reagan to Jerry Falwell saw it, she and the legions of homemakers she had mobilized at coffee clatches and PTA meetings over the past decade and a half were responsible for scoring a major victory for the ascendant conservative movement. Specifically, killing the ERA protected the nuclear family from the depredations of evil feminist intent on undermining this bedrock American institution. Feminism, conservatives announced, was an anti-family movement. But such declarations denied nearly 200 years of American history. Feminists have never been dead set on destroying the family before, during, or after Schlafly's heyday. On the contrary, American feminists have consistently championed policies that shore up the family, often in the face of intense conservative opposition. Schlafly exploited a moment when feminism had indeed expanded to support the rights of women as more than mothers, making the movement vulnerable to accusations of undermining the family. However, feminist activists have only continued to this day their 2-century-long fight to strengthen families and to define this fundamental institution more inclusively. This history was deliberately denied on that night in 1982. From the podium, Falwell lauded Schlafly's Stop ERA movement as just the beginning of the wholesale conservative renaissance he envisioned. Ironically benefiting from the feminism she abhorred, Schlafly happily accepted such praise from the men who had, until recently, spurned her opinions on any policy outside of the women's issues they considered her turf. But as the band played Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead, Schlafly must have been especially buoyed by her own apparently prescient observation, reported 3 years earlier by the Washington Post, that the women's lib movement is going to self-destruct because they are not going to have any babies, and if they do have them, they won't take care of them, so our children will be the ones who are well cared for and well adjusted. History, it seemed on that summer night, was on Schlafly's side, in a war that she and her conservative allies painted as a long-standing conflict between traditional God-fearing Americans who valued the institution of the family and the radical feminists who sought to destroy it. The ERA victory was important, but it didn't mean that the fight was over. Schlafly announced she would next turn to eradicating feminist influences that undermined the family in the schoolhouse. You can't show a picture of a woman washing dishes, she wrote of contemporary children's literature, not to mention the family life education classes in which liberals promoted sexual experimentation, inappropriate challenges to gendered family roles, and general immorality. Stocking school libraries with pro-family titles and eradicating such curricula was the next front. Schlafly and her followers believed in vanquishing the feminists who would just as soon see teenagers get pregnant, wives go off to the office, and children be left in the care of government institutions, or just as bad, in the arms of an emasculated husband. By the night of the pro-family ball, this dichotomy between feminism and family was an entrenched plank of conservative messaging, and it has endured. But the historical record on which this supposed opposition relies is dubious. Feminism has been an effort to strengthen the family and offer policies that allow parents and their children to flourish rather than struggle from the challenges presented by the marketplace, austerity policy, and restrictive ideas about gender and race. Few activist American women in the antebellum era, many who were pious Protestants, used the term feminism, coined by French socialist Charles Fourier in the 1830s. But these women who worked to reform society were unquestionably the foremothers of those who soon adopted the label self-consciously, Protecting the integrity of the family was at the heart of their activism. For example, fighting against the social evil of alcohol in order to safeguard the home and marital sanctity animated many women who joined organizations such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Drunken men were more likely to beat and cheat on their wives. Cracking down on prostitution was another antebellum cause, and squandering one's wages on alcohol could ultimately leave a family destitute. Speaking out about social policy, or curbing men's purchasing power, did not conform with dominant ideas about female propriety. But to the extent that women were defending realms within their purview, the home and family, they enjoyed greater latitude. Temperance activists made this argument explicitly when some men questioned the appropriateness of their activism. Women were not leaving their own proper sphere or usurping the prerogative of the other sex, but acting strictly in accordance with the Word of God. Their gender exerted a softening, ennobling, and purifying influence. Indeed, 19th century women reformers invoked their identities as caregivers to fight for children's welfare by supporting hospitals, common schools, and even an orphan train movement that relocated immigrant children to live with families in the rural West. These efforts were largely advanced by native-born white women who celebrated a familial structure most familiar to them. But their invocation of family resonated with abolitionists, such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, who appealed for emancipation by arguing that the cruelest aspect of enslavement was the destruction of families. The fight for women's suffrage came under fire as an attack on the family. Opponents decried that the political independence of women would somehow prevent them from their traditional role of raising children. After all, the women who fought for suffrage made their pleas in the idiom of enlightenment, individualism, and independence. The 1848 Declaration of Sentiments was modeled directly on the Declaration of Independence, a document that severed what many considered a metaphorically familial relationship between imperial parent and dependent colonized child. It took more than 70 years for women's suffrage to be codified with the 19th Amendment. Suffragists were successful at reframing the debate, arguing that the right to vote and what historians call maternalism went hand in hand. White women should be granted the franchise because they, especially as mothers, were moral beacons, and the vote would enable them to instill this essential virtue in their families and to transmit it broadly to a world that sorely needed salvation. To be sure, the fight for women's suffrage involved a limited vision of the family, one narrowly defined as white and straight. One of the most pernicious social ills facing families, argued suffragists such as Emma Willard, who built her career through the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was the growing power of recently enfranchised Black men, whom she saw as undisciplined drunks who, like locusts, threatened the safety of the white women, of childhood, of the home. Black women resisted this racism, consistently fighting for a more expansive definition of equality. The women who were thought to deserve the protection of the state were defined similarly narrowly by early 20th century feminists, and only in relation to their familial status, as mothers. State support for mothers, like children, was imperative because of their assumed inherent dependence on a male breadwinner. Absent his presence, the state must step in as a kind of surrogate father that upheld an idealized domestic economy. The Children's Bureau, as Linda Gordon has shown, discouraged the single women to whom they dispense aid from working outside the home, and the Bureau would not collaborate with labor unions on its welfare efforts. Single working women could have used such support, for their wages were often unfairly depressed by the assumption that they should be working only for pin money, as opposed to supporting themselves or a household. Rather than establish a living wage, the successful legislation that recognized women's labor only reaffirmed their essential dependence and domestic responsibilities, establishing limits on working hours and physical and moral hazards, from lifting heavy loads to tending bar. Establishing social welfare institutions and labor laws that recognized women as citizens and laborers was undoubtedly a feminist watershed. But the fights that activists of this era picked just as unquestionably upheld a family supported by a breadwinning father and a caregiving mother rather than challenging it. No feminist initiative shored up this traditional familial model as much as early 20th century activism around young women's sexual and reproductive autonomy, ironically, the realms that social conservatives usually caricature as their progressive enemies' gravest assaults on this bedrock institution. Extending the protective ethos of labor legislation to the bodies of young women and girls, by 1920, women's rights activists advanced laws that raised the age of sexual consent to 16 or 18 in every continental state, except Georgia, where it remained at 14 until 1995. In the case of adolescent girls, the intention was to protect the vulnerable from abuse and seduction by older men, but raising the age of consent could also serve to criminalize young, sexually active, usually working-class women, who were punished as delinquents. Such legislation gave parents, who could invoke the law to separate their daughter from a slightly older suitor they disliked, greater power over their daughters, reinscribing the idea that the only appropriate place to express sexuality was within the marital bond. Planned Parenthood is probably the institution that has provided the most enduring grist for the myth that feminists hate families. The problem, according to conservatives, is the organization's role in promoting and disseminating contraception, and later providing abortion, which undermines women's fundamental social role as mothers. But Margaret Sanger, who founded the American Birth Control League in 1921, which became Planned Parenthood 2 decades later, envisioned her activism as a way to build healthier families through more deliberate planning. Her experience was personal, as she had watched her mother endure 7 miscarriages that permanently debilitated her, to say nothing of the exhaustion of raising her 11 surviving children before dying of tuberculosis at age 50. At a time when childbirth still proved fatal to many women, providing maternal health services was hardly a rejection of the institution of the family. Rather, it was a way to rescue women from the kind of suffering that Sanger witnessed firsthand. Still, Sanger's proposition that women exert some autonomy over their fertility was perceived as pornographic, and she was arrested for circulating obscene, lewd, or lascivious material, articles about birth control, and later served 30 days in jail for creating a public nuisance by offering contraception to women who traveled across state lines to avail themselves of these services. Planned Parenthood spawned another myth worth debunking here, because it has proved durable. That Sanger embraced eugenics and sought to control the Black population through the Negro Project she developed in the 1930s with prominent Black leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. Building on her work with poor white ethnic immigrants who were most vulnerable to quack doctors whose family planning interventions ranged from ineffective to lethal, Sanger first worked with Black community leaders to open a clinic in Harlem, staffed by Black health professionals. Buoyed by this success and the suggestion of Black leaders such as Mary McLeod Bethune and Ida B. Wells, Sanger expanded the program to serve African American women in the rural South, where services were even more lacking, and the clinic was well received. Sanger did identify the over-fertility of the mentally and physically defective as a social problem, in an idiom that is alarming today and should have been then, but she never advocated for culling racial or ethnic groups through contraception. In fact, the Nazi Party banned and burned Sanger's publications because it believed that family planning would undermine the propagation of the Aryan race. Crucially, the sort of family planning that Planned Parenthood provided was so uncontroversial that for much of the 20th century, prominent conservatives voiced their support for the organization. In 1964, former Republican President Dwight Eisenhower joined former Democratic President Harry Truman as honorary chairman of the organization. During his tenure, President Nixon actively backed the Family Planning Services and Population Research Act, Title X, of which built on liberal Great Society programs to become the only federal program that provided family planning services, focusing on low-income citizens. Celebrity evangelist Billy Graham, who would become one of the most vocal proponents of a narrowly defined conservative family values movement, a linchpin of which was condemning Planned Parenthood, had openly told the press in 1959 that nothing in the Bible prevents birth control. 9 years later, he convened the Protestant Symposium on the Control of Human Production, and its influential attendees overwhelmingly supported the use of contraception among married couples. Not only did feminists perceive Planned Parenthood as an institution that would empower families, conservatives enthusiastically signed on to this vision. The notion that conservatives have been waging a multi-generational, moral war to protect American families from the destructive impulses of feminists in general, and Planned Parenthood in particular, is a fiction invented by modern conservatives who deliberately ignore this history to stoke contemporary partisan proclivities. This consensus soon frayed, however. When Roe v. Wade legalized a woman's right to choose an abortion in 1973, and Planned Parenthood began providing pregnancy termination as a small part of their maternal health and family planning services, a new generation of Republican activists, eager to court conservative Catholics and consolidate evangelical support, seized upon this case as clear evidence that feminists were out to destroy families by killing unborn babies. When Reagan won the presidency in 1980, most Republicans actually supported some access to abortion, as of a piece with individual liberty and privacy from government intervention. Conservatives were correct that this generation of feminists was unapologetically fighting for women's bodily autonomy and greater openness about sexuality. But they misunderstood these efforts as undermining the family, when in fact they were often intended to undergird it. In 1965, feminists hailed the Supreme Court's Griswold v. Connecticut decision, which allowed married couples to use birth control, a win that surely invested women with more power over their bodies, but it just as certainly only further legally encoded the special legitimacy of the family. Deliberately named family life education, not the more readily misinterpreted sex education, programs rolled out in some school districts in the late 1950s functioned similarly. Liberals struck by the open eroticism of popular culture, thanks to the Supreme Court's narrowing of the definition of obscenity, devised curricula to help children understand that sexual desire was a natural part of human development, but that it was appropriately consummated only within heterosexual marriage. To conservatives, acknowledging and destigmatizing sexual pleasure with children in tax-supported schools not only trespassed on parental authority to broach such issues, but also fundamentally attacked what they understood as the chief purpose of sex and of the family: procreation. Never mind that even the most incendiary of such curricula instructed that homosexuality was an illness and culminated in a lesson about building a happy marriage. Presuming that this was students' only logical life path, conservatives successfully painted these curricula as part of a nefarious plot, cooked up by feminists, communists, and other one-worlders and child seducers who were intent on subverting America, beginning with its children. Hundreds of such moderate programs did the opposite, fortifying the family by arguing that a happy, heterosexual marriage was the only appropriate place for pursuing sexual pleasure. Some feminists found political allies among a liberal policy establishment similarly invested, at times fixated, in valorizing the two-parent family. In 1965, Assistant Secretary of Labor Daniel Patrick Moynihan published a 90-page report on the plight of the Negro family, which he and his staffers argued was at the heart of racial inequality that persisted a full century after the close of the Civil War. Despite securing formal legal equality, greater income, and increased levels of educational attainment, the Negro family in the urban ghettos is crumbling, Moynihan argued, and only a concerted national effort to fortify the stable Negro family structure could interrupt this cycle of poverty and disadvantage. This was hardly a feminist position. The first section of the report's most famous chapter, titled The Tangle of Pathology, unsparingly vilified matriarchy, and Black feminists were understandably enraged that the economic and social strength that Black women exhibited as heads of household was portrayed as a source of social malaise rather than of collective uplift. On the contrary, they argued to expand the notion of a functional family, and that the rough equality which came into existence out of necessity and is now ingrained in the Black lifestyle could provide an alternative to the hierarchical white family structure enshrined by a political culture that spanned parties and generations. But despite these critiques, the fact remained that the major political party most sympathetic to the feminist cause, the Democrats, was reaffirming the patriarchal nuclear family as core, even to the apparently unrelated policy priority of racial equality. Such breadwinner liberalism had long formed the basis for welfare policy, and in the polarizing 1960s, it was an especially attractive position in that it built bridges with conservatives who increasingly could not ignore racial injustice, but who preferred solutions that centered personal responsibility over policy intervention. Similarly, some leading feminists calculated that continuing to prop up the nuclear family might advance the cause of women's liberation more effectively than promoting the radical politics amplified on college campuses and among activists increasingly resisting gradualist approaches. The year after the release of the Moynihan Report, a diverse group of feminists gathered in Betty Friedan's hotel room, each chipping in $5 to establish the National Organization for Women, NOW. But the organization made clear that it was seeking to defend the rights of certain women, heterosexuals in traditional marriages. When one lesbian couple attempted to renew their membership at the advertised couples membership, they were rebuffed and told that this deal was meant to attract husbands of their ostensibly straight membership. Friedan, who had become famous for decrying the malaise of suburban wifehood in The Feminine Mystique, doubled down on this exclusivity and in 1969 insisted that amplifying the concerns of this lavender menace would only give ammunition to conservative opponents and threaten the movement's mainstream acceptance. Indeed, feminists seized the opportunity to channel the resources of Great Society federal programs to bolster women and families in less controversial ways. Head Start began in the summer of 1965 as a multi-week early childhood education program, soon authorized by Congress with bipartisan support to run all year. Providing prenatal health services and child care, as well as socialization and instruction to economically disadvantaged families, Head Start proved an important resource for parents, especially mothers, as well as children. Feminist mobilization that did not center mothers and families so explicitly still advanced these realms, as in President Johnson relenting in 1967 to specifically guarantee equal employment opportunity regardless of sex, a crucial development for women supporting families. A decade later, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 also ensured that working mothers could more reliably provide for their children. Less visible in vaunted feminist campaigns also prioritize family stability. The interracial federally employed women group advocated for flexible work scheduling and part-time options that better suited mothers, and others sought a guaranteed income that would effectively compensate caregivers for domestic labor. Outside of the policy realm, feminist health advocates and a more mystical strand of the movement celebrated motherhood as important, even divine work, to which women were uniquely suited. It is true that another form of feminism that explicitly decentered motherhood and family also gained traction in this era. Women actively participated in an expansive political left that interrogated every social institution, from the military to the media, and some seized on traditional gender roles as representing the root of social injustice. "Marriage is a joke," said Australian feminist Germaine Greer, whose best-selling 1970 book, The Female Eunuch, unsparingly condemned monogamy as a maniacal idea. Life magazine incredulously reported that Greer even knocks motherhood, strident perspectives that made her a star performer globally. Her willowy frame, long hair, and unapologetic heterosexual appetites contrasted with both the image of the organizer homemaker running for the school board or registering voters and that of the similarly outspoken Kate Millett, whom Greer dismissed as emblematic of that whole pants and battle dress routine, but who as a queer woman also challenged the notion that heterosexual marriage and motherhood were inextricable from female identity. Millett clashed with Friedan, but Now leadership dialed down its homophobia in 1971 and recognized lesbians as a legitimate concern for feminism. Many activists visibly allied with the broader fight for gay liberation, establishing the foundation for a broader definition of family that would include gay and lesbian parents. At the time, however, this alignment was more resonant with the feminist rallying cry for female bodily autonomy, as activists successfully fought for abortion rights and legal recognition of sexual violence, from stranger rape to battery, at the hands of husbands and boyfriends. A growing movement for youth self-determination, arguing for rights as varied as that of boys to wear long hair to protest the Vietnam War at school, challenged the notion that children must always bend to the authority of their elders. In a similar idiom, to women pushing back on patriarchy ever more insistently. Contrary to popular lore, no bras were ever burned, but the attitude that the conventional constraints of femininity should be shucked off, or at least interrogated, gained power, and fueled a conservative opposition that painted these preoccupations as attacks on motherhood in particular and the family in general. In response to the Boston Globe's coverage of the fight over the Equal Rights Amendment, 4 readers wrote to complain that even the relatively liberal newspaper perpetuated the false dichotomy, that ERA opponents were feminine homemakers, whereas supporters are seen as divorced, radical feminists, man-haters, and/or lesbians. The 4 writers, happily married homemakers and mothers, and ERA advocates wanted to set the record straight. Long-standing activism to mobilize state support for working mothers, children, and families persisted throughout this era, but was often overshadowed by popular, often exaggerated imagery of uninhibited co-eds, radical lesbians, and unshaven hippies enthralled to an unrestrained political culture that privileged the self-involvement and sexual liberation above all. Feminists were indeed shifting away from protective efforts that presumed women's dependency and domesticity to an activism predicated on gender equality and a forceful articulation of the state's responsibility to guarantee it. This hardly meant that they turned their attention from the home. Indeed, during the 1970s and 1980s, feminists sharpened their focus on domestic violence, notably concentrating on the crime of marital rape, which in most states had been deliberately accepted from laws governing sexual violence, based on the perverse but prevalent rationale that this was a private matter, and secondarily, that vindictive women would use it as a legal cudgel to come after their husbands. If you can't rape your wife, who can you rape? A California legislator allegedly joked when the measure first came across his desk. Women's liberationists such as Laura X., who had taken the name to protest women's status as the property of men, began a state-by-state campaign to heighten awareness of marital rape and date rape and to make them illegal. In 1986, thanks to collaboration with legal organizations and campus activists and to sympathetic media portrayal, marital rape was criminalized on federal lands, and 7 years later, all 50 states had laws on the books outlining it. Inspired by this activism, which also combated incest, wife-beating, and pornography, the United Nations Women's Conference soon voted to resolve that women have a right to refuse sex to their husbands. Supportive statements from religious leaders from Catholic, Presbyterian, Pentecostal, Islamic, Jewish, and Buddhist leaders, hardly predictably feminist allies, followed, arguably because such efforts strengthened the familial bonds important to all their societies and faiths. Feminist efforts outside the home during this period also cemented family relations within it. Building on successful efforts in the 1970s to ensure that employers treated pregnancy and related disabilities such as miscarriage, abortion, and recovery from childbirth, like other temporary medical conditions, feminists turned their efforts to codifying federal commitments to uphold a more expansively defined family. In 1984, they introduced the Family Employment Security Act, which called for workers to be able to take 26 weeks of unpaid leave in order to recover from childbirth or to care for a spouse or child suffering from a range of illnesses and disabilities. As proposed, the bill fell short of many feminist aims in not demanding paid leave, which would have more assuredly freed workers from non-domestic labor. And before ratification as the Family and Medical Leave Act, FMLA, in 1993, it encountered substantial stalling and resistance, including 2 presidential vetoes. But the version of the FMLA that ultimately passed also included a provision for caregiving for elderly parents. In 2015, expanded to cover same-sex spouses, and has been crucial in keeping family care at the forefront of the national agenda, even as the United States lags behind every other Western nation in such policy protections. Such efforts sought only to strengthen American families, but the members of a growing conservative movement resisted these policies ever more energetically, claiming with unprecedented fervor that they were safekeepers of the family values that morally debased feminists, now with the help of big government bureaucrats, sought to destroy. It wasn't just extremists. A 1977 poll showed that 40% of Americans understood the institution of the family to be in decline, and feminists its key antagonists. To the extent that family values meant shielding a patriarchal home at all costs from any state intervention, Schlafly and the GOP establishment that had warmed to her were correct. That feminists had long strived, often with the help of government, to boost women's economic and legal status within and beyond the family. But crucially, these efforts were intended to strengthen rather than undermine family structure. In the late Cold War, however, this conservative framing gained traction, for traditionalists posited the archetypal American family, as rooted in a Christian individualism under threat by collectivist, godless communism. Throughout the 1980s, activist Christian groups such as the Moral Majority and Focus on the Family amplified this message, pointing squarely at feminists, gay liberationists, and civil rights activists as a threat to individuals, families, and the nation. But which families? In a polity becoming more demographically and culturally diverse, social conservatives enshrined a family that was narrowly defined and ever more exclusive. For example, white parents who opposed sex education or social studies curricula as anathema to the values they espoused in their home were celebrated by a growing conservative media network as bravely defending the sacred family. Yet working-class Latino immigrants who protested that the racist depictions of their culture that their children encountered at school insulted their heritage or who requested Spanish language communications as a matter of practicality, were often dismissed, with insistence on the superiority of the neutral, English-only civic sphere. A broader politics of austerity promoted by the self-declared Party of Family Values slashed welfare, childcare, and healthcare while expanding a prison system that over the next several decades came to incarcerate Black men at more than 6 times the rate of white men, developments that unquestionably destabilized many families. Despite these glaring contradictions, conservatives successfully managed to sustain the fantasy that the ideal American family was white, Christian, and heterosexual, and that only GOP policies could safeguard it from destruction by feminists and their progressive allies. But as Stephanie Coontz has written, as effectively as this imagined American family taps into conservative nostalgia, it is most accurately understood as the way we never were. Family structure has always been complex and varied, but in the early decades of the 21st century, it has become more publicly and acceptably so. Blended families, divorced parents, and gay couples are all over popular media, reflecting substantial legal and cultural changes. Furthermore, a strand of third-wave feminism that champions women's freedom to be homemakers as an equally legitimate path to working outside the home, and that invests traditionally feminine domestic pastimes such as cooking and knitting with new gravitas, has deflated the caricature of the childless, man-hating feminist sustained by takeout and surrounded by cats. Embarrassing betrayals of the traditional family values that conservatives purport to uphold have not helped their case. In 1974, Christian Crusade evangelist Billy James Hargis was accused of sleeping with male and female Bible students at American Christian College and was forced to resign his position as the institution's president. Still, he benefited from a relatively discreet media culture and the fealty of local newspapers and law enforcement that downplayed or downright ignored the accusations. Nearly a decade later, when California State Senator John Schmitz, who had burnished his right-wing credentials speaking against communism, sex education, and racial minorities, was outed for a decade-long affair that bore 2 children, his political career effectively ended. Examples of such hypocrisy among ever higher profile figures, from Jim Baker to Jerry Falwell Jr. to Donald Trump, have only accumulated over the decades, making the idea of conservative guardianship of family values, now or ever, still less tenable. Since the 1990s, the GOP has half-heartedly tried to cement its position as defender of family values by courting socially conservative Latino voters, but the images of Border Patrol agents separating immigrant children from their parents' arms as a part of the Trump administration's family separation deterrence policy will likely prove hard to forget. Ironically, as the GOP becomes less able to present itself as defending a traditional American family from feminist siege, conservatives are promoting a new myth in its stead. The GOP as the party of women's rights. Feminism is a bridge too far. Cracking open the door to the boys' club only slightly, Republicans have patted themselves on the back for elevating white women such as Sarah Palin, Kellyanne Conway, and Sarah Sanders to high-ranking positions. But like Ivanka Trump's hollow Women Who Work treatise, which fails to acknowledge the phalanx of service workers and web of family connections that make her own career possible, this desiccated version of empowerment is irrelevant to most women who have little in common with these individuals who deploy their power to prop up patriarchy rather than topple it. Moreover, the emergence of the violent incel movement, which supplants the chivalry of an older conservative ethos with a men's rights worldview that understands women's bodily autonomy as an affront, reveals the shallowness of such commitment to women's rights. The intensity with which an increasingly intersectional feminist movement has evolved to take on issues as varied as imperialism and online gaming can make the concerns of families seem almost quaint. Indeed, across the political spectrum, movements that center motherhood, from Moms Demand Action to Moms, formerly Homemakers for America, often aim to strike a universalist, uncontroversial tone despite taking on divisive issues such as gun violence and religion, respectively. But the pandemic, which drove more than 1 million women out of the paid workforce, largely to perform unremunerated caregiving labor, has made clear that crucial needs of mothers and children remain unmet. Historically consistent in blaming progressives in general, and feminists in particular, for social ills, conservatives cry that the real problem is overzealous leftists who want to corrupt children with ideas that will make them ashamed of their heritage, unsure of their gender, and disrespectful of their parents. Feminists no longer need to position themselves uniquely as mothers for political strategy, but they continue to fight for policies such as family leave, pay equity, child tax credits, robust schooling, and the affordable housing and childcare that more than 2 centuries of feminist activist labors have proved to uphold rather than undermine American families.